Hello and welcome. I am glad you have found your way here tonight, to this place of smoke, wood, and snow. We are about to spend a long, dark winter in the Viking Age. This story is designed simply for calm and for rest. There is no need to follow every word. Feel free to let your mind drift with the falling snow and to fall asleep whenever you are ready. Find your most comfortable position. Close your eyes and listen to the sounds of a life of brutal endurance. Our journey tonight takes us back more than 1,000 years to a small village on the edge of a Norwegian fjord. We will explore the daily struggle for survival against the cold, the darkness, and the gnawing hunger of a long Scandinavian winter. So rest now. Our story begins in the late autumn of the year 874 AD. The air in the small village of Rxstad, nestled deep within a Norwegian fjord, is crisp and cold. It carries the sharp, clean scent of pine smoke from the longhouse chimneys, the damp, earthy smell of the last harvest, and the salty temps of the nearby sea. This is a time of frantic preparation, a race against the inevitable arrival of the great enemy. Winter. We are following a family led by a farmer named Eric. He is a man in his early 30s, his body hardened by a life of labor, his beard thick and red. His face weathered by the sun and wind, stands at the edge of his field. Looking up at the steep, dark mountains that surround the fjord. The peaks are already dusted with the first snow, a stark white warning against the deep green of the pine forests below. His wife Sigrid is in the small turf-roofed storehouse, her movements quick and efficient. She is supervising the final storage of their winter provisions. There are sacks of barley and rye, barrels of salted fish and pork, and strings of dried onions and herbs hanging from the rafters. Their entire survival for the next 6 months depends on what is in this small, dark, and cold building. Their 2 young children, a boy and a girl. Every single piece of food, no matter how small, is precious. The coming winter is predicted to be a long and harsh one, and the village elders have been warning for weeks that the stores must be plentiful. The village itself is a small community of a dozen or so longhouses, clustered together on a strip of flat land by the water's edge. The longhouses are magnificent structures, built from massive oak timbers, their roofs covered in a thick layer of living turf for insulation. They are long, low, and slightly curved, resembling the shape of an upturned ship. In the center of each house, a plume of smoke rises from a hole in the roof, a sign of the hearth fire that is the heart of every Viking home. As the days of autumn grow shorter, the work becomes more urgent. Eric and the other men of the village spend their days chopping wood, a seemingly endless task. The pile of firewood outside each longhouse grows into a small mountain, a fortress of fuel against the coming cold. They also bring the last of their livestock, a few cows, some sheep, and goats in from the high summer pastures, securing them in the byres that are often attached to the longhouses themselves. The final task before the snows come is to prepare the longship. The village's prized vessel is pulled from the water and dragged high up onto the shore, placed carefully under a protective wooden shelter. Its great red woolen sail is taken down, carefully folded and stored. The hull is inspected for damage, and fresh tar is applied to the seams. The ship, the village's link to the outside world, will sleep through the long winter, just as the land itself will sleep under a blanket of snow, and then one morning it arrives, the first heavy snowfall. It does not begin gently. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, turns a sudden heavy gray, and then the snow begins to fall, not in delicate flakes, but in a thick, silent, and relentless curtain of white. By midday, the entire landscape is transformed. The green fields are gone, the dark mountains are covered, and the fjord itself begins to take on a strange, slushy texture. The village is now locked in. The mountain passes are impassable. The sea, soon to be choked with ice, is a treacherous and deadly barrier. They are completely and totally isolated, a small island of human life in a vast, white, and silent world. As darkness falls on this first night of winter, the family gathers around the central hearth fire in their longhouse. The wind begins to howl outside, a low, mournful sound. The long, dark night of the Scandinavian winter has truly begun. With the arrival of the snow, the world outside the longhouse ceased to exist. The frantic energy of the autumn preparations was replaced by a deep and profound quiet. The village of Ulrikstad was no longer a collection of individual homes. It had become a series of small, isolated islands of warmth and life, each one a fortress against the encroaching cold and darkness. For Eric, Sigrid, and their children, the longhouse was now their entire universe. The longhouse was a masterpiece of Viking engineering, a structure designed for survival. Its walls were made of thick, vertical oak planks, and its long, curved roof was covered in a heavy layer of earth and turf, which was now hidden under an even thicker blanket of insulating snow. The only openings were a single, heavy wooden door at each end, and a smoke hole in the center of the roof. There were no windows. To have windows would be to invite the winter inside. Stepping into the longhouse from the stark white world outside was to step into a world of perpetual twilight. The interior was a single, long, cavernous hall. The air was thick and heavy, a complex and potent mixture of smells. The sharp, comforting scent of the burning pine in the central hearth, the smell of smoked fish hanging from the rafters, the damp, earthy scent of the floor, the smell of wet wool of unwashed bodies, and the rich, pungent animal smell of their livestock. For in a true Viking winter, the family did not live alone. The most valuable of their animals, the milk cow, a few sheep, and the goats were brought inside to live with them in a partitioned-off section at one end of the longhouse. This was a practical decision. The body heat of the animals helped to keep the longhouse warm. It protected the precious livestock from the brutal cold and from predators like wolves. But it also meant that the family shared their living space with a small barn. The constant low sounds of the animals, a soft moo, the rustle of hay, the occasional bleat, became a familiar part of the winter soundtrack. The rich animal smell was an ever-present and inescapable part of the atmosphere. The floor of the byre, a mixture of dirt and animal dung, had to be mucked out regularly, a grim and smelly task. The heart of the longhouse, and the heart of their winter life, was the long, rectangular fire pit, the langold, that ran down the center of the hall. This was their only source of heat and their only source of light. The fire was never allowed to go out. The first task of the morning, in the freezing darkness, was to stoke the embers back to life. The last task of the night was to bank the fire so it would smolder safely until dawn. The fire, however, came at a price. The smoke did not have a proper chimney, but simply rose and escaped, hopefully through the smoke hole in the roof. In reality, A thick, acrid layer of smoke perpetually filled the high, dark rafters of the longhouse. The air was often hazy, and the smoke would sting their eyes and catch in their throats. Over the years, the inside of a longhouse would become coated in a thick, black, greasy layer of soot. The family's life was now lived almost entirely in the small circle of light and warmth cast by this fire. They would sit on the simple wooden benches that lined the walls, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, while the corners of the great hall remained in a deep, impenetrable darkness. The world had shrunk to the size of this small, smoky, and crowded room. The first few days of this confinement felt almost cozy. There was a sense of security, of being safe and warm, while the wind howled and the snow piled up outside. The frantic work of the harvest was over, and a slower, more deliberate rhythm took hold. Sigrid would set up her great wooden loom. The rhythmic thump-clack of her weaving would become a steady, comforting beat in the quiet hall. Eric would take out his tools and begin the endless winter tasks of mending and making. He would repair a broken axe handle, carve a new set of teeth for a wooden rake, or meticulously mend a leather harness, his hand strong and sure in the firelight. The children, their outside world now a forbidden landscape of white, would sit by the fire learning these essential skills, their small hands trying to copy the movements of their parents. As the first weeks of winter pass, the initial, cozy feeling of being safe and sheltered in the longhouse begins to fade, replaced by a new and more challenging reality: the darkness. In the high latitudes of Norway, the winter sun is a weak and distant stranger. The days become shockingly short. The sun would rise late, a pale, watery disk that barely seemed to clear the southern mountain peaks. And then it would set again, only a few hours later. The world was now a place of perpetual twilight and deep, profound night. For 16, sometimes 18 hours a day, the village of Arkstad was plunged into an absolute inky blackness, a darkness that was broken only by the light of the moon on the snow, or the flickering yellow glow of the fires within the longhouses.
Oh, yes.
This was the long night, a psychological trial that was, in many ways, more difficult to endure than the cold itself. This endless darkness began to warp the family's sense of time. A clear distinction between day and night should govern their lives of farming and fishing, dissolved into a long, dreamlike continuum. They learned to measure time not by the sun, but by the rhythm of their indoor tasks. The time it took to card a bundle of wool, the time it took to sharpen a set of tools, the slow, steady progress of the weaving on Sigrid's loom. The central hearth fire, the Langold, was now the absolute center of their universe. It was their sun, their only source of light and warmth in a world of cold and dark. The family's entire existence was lived within the small, flickering circle of its glow. Eric and Sigrid would sit on the benches that lined the walls, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames, while the far corners of the great hall remained in a deep, impenetrable darkness, at a place of imagined shadows and strange creaking sounds. To combat the encroaching darkness, both outside and within their own minds, the family turned to the most powerful tool of Viking culture, the spoken word. The long, dark nights of winter were a time for stories. It was a time to pass on the history, the mythology, and the wisdom of their people from one generation to the next. One evening, as the wind howled outside, creating a mournful, wailing sound as it passed over the turf roof, Eric gathered his children close to the fire. His voice, in the quiet of the longhouse, took on a low, rhythmic, and mesmerizing quality. "Listen," he began, "and I will tell you of the beginning of all things. Before there was sand or sea or the cool waves, there was only a great empty void, the Ginnungagap." He told them of the fire world of Muspelheim and the ice world of Niflheim, and how from the meeting of fire and ice, the first great giant Ymir was born. He described how the gods, Odin and his brothers, slew the giant and created the world from his body. From Ymir's flesh, Eric chanted, his voice a low rumble, they made the earth. From his blood, they made the oceans and the rivers. From his bones, they made the mountains, and from his teeth, they made the rocks and the stones. He continued, and from his great skull, they made the sky, and they placed a dwarf at each of the four corners to hold it up. They took the glowing embers that flew from the fire world, and they scattered them across the great dark skull, and these became the sun, the moon, and the stars. For the children huddled by the fire, this was not a mere story. It was the living truth. It explained the world they lived in, the mountains that surrounded them, the stars they could sometimes see through the smoke hole in the roof. These stories were more than just entertainment. They were a vital psychological tool. It populated the great, terrifying darkness with figures of meaning and purpose. The howling wind was not just wind. It was the breath of a great giant. The crash of thunder was the sound of Thor's hammer, a reminder that the gods were fighting on their behalf against the forces of chaos. The sagas gave a sense of order and meaning to a life that was often harsh, unpredictable, and frightening. In this world of deep and abiding darkness, the belief in magic and superstition also grew stronger. Sigrid would spend hours carving protective runes, ancient symbols of power, onto small pieces of wood. She would hang them over the main door to protect the house from evil spirits, or place them in the children's beds to ward off sickness. Eric would carefully check the runes he had carved into the handle of his axe, a prayer to the gods for strength and good fortune. This was not a primitive belief. It was a practical and necessary part of their spiritual survival kit. The stories and the rituals were a powerful shield for the mind, but the body had to endure the physical reality of their confinement. After months of being sealed inside, the longhouse, which had once been a refuge, began to feel more like a prison. The constant thick smoke from the central hearth coated every surface with a thin, greasy layer of soot. The air was heavy and stale, a recycled mixture of smoke, human breath, and the pungent smell of the animals at the other end of the hall. The lack of sunlight and fresh air began to take its toll. The family's skin grew pale and sallow. A deep, unshakable weariness settled into their bones. The darkness was not just outside. It was a physical presence that seemed to sap the very life force from them. Their world was one of shadows, of flickering firelight, and of the deep, impenetrable blackness that lurked in the corners of the hall. As the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, approached, a new and more tangible fear began to creep into the family's life. The fear of scarcity. The supplies, which had seemed so plentiful in the autumn, were now visibly dwindling. One evening, after the children were asleep, Eric and Sigrid took a single, precious tallow candle and went to the storehouse to take inventory. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows over the room. Sigrid ran her hand through a barrel of barley, her fingers reaching deeper than they should have to find the grain. Eric counted the remaining pieces of salted fish, his expression grim. The winter had been colder than expected, and they had been forced to use more firewood and eat more of their rations to maintain their strength. Their careful calculations from the autumn were no longer valid. The numbers on their mental ledger were frightening. Eric walked down to the edge of the fjord the next day. The water, which was their lifeline, their connection to the outside world, was now a solid, unmoving field of thick gray ice. The ice stretched from one side of the fjord to the other, a silent, unbreakable barrier. There would be no fishing until the spring. They were completely dependent on the food that was stored within the walls of their longhouse. This new, gnawing anxiety was a quiet and private thing, a burden that Eric and Sigrid carried without speaking of it to the children. They began to subtly ration the food even more. The portions of porridge became slightly smaller. The pieces of dried fish were cut a little thinner. Every meal was now tinged with the unspoken fear of the hunger that was to come. To combat the growing despair of the darkest part of the year, the village held a small, defiant feast for the winter solstice. It was a celebration of survival, a way to bolster their spirits for the long, hard months that still lay ahead. For one day, the strict rationing was relaxed. Precious salted ham was boiled, and a special sweet bread was baked with the last of their honey. The family gathered around the fire, the taste of the rich, savory meat a forgotten luxury on their tongues. They drank a small amount of strong ale, its warmth spreading through their cold limbs. Eric told the story of Thor's great battle with the giants of Jotunheim, a tale of courage and strength in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a brief, precious moment of light and warmth in a world of darkness and cold. But as the feast ended and the family settled down to sleep, the grim reality of their situation remained. They had passed the darkest day, but the coldest and hungriest part of the winter was still ahead of them. The great white wolf of famine was now circling their small village, waiting in the silent, snow-covered forest. Their survival was not guaranteed. It would depend on their strength, their endurance, and the hope that the spring would not come too late. The winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, has passed. But this astronomical turning point offers no real comfort. The coldest, hardest, and hungriest months of the winter, January and February now, lie ahead of the family. The initial, almost cozy feeling of being safely sheltered from the snow is a distant memory, replaced by the grim, monotonous reality of a life lived in a single, dark, and smoky room. This is the battle against the cold. The longhouse, which had been a fortress against the first storms, now feels more like a prison. It is the family's entire universe, a self-contained world of shadows, smoke, and the constant close presence of others. The outside world, a landscape of deep snow and howling wind, is a place of death. But the inside, the place of life, has its own slow, creeping dangers to the body and the spirit. The absolute heart of their existence is the central hearth fire, the Langild. It is a long rectangular pit of stones that runs down the center of the hall. The fire within it is never, ever allowed to go out. To let the fire die would be to surrender to the cold and the darkness, a death sentence. Eric's first and last duty of every day is to tend to this fire, is to carefully bank the embers at night and to coax them back to life in the freezing pre-dawn blackness. The fire is their sun, their only source of light and warmth. The family lives their entire life within its flickering, golden circle of influence. They cook here, they work here, they tell their stories here. The flames cast long, dancing shadows that make the far corners of the longhouse seem like a different, darker world. The children learn to read the language of the fire, the pop and crackle of dry pine, the low hiss of damp wood, the deep, steady roar of a well-fed blaze. But this life-giving fire comes at a terrible price: the smoke. The longhouse has no chimney, only a single small hole in the turf roof directly above the hearth. This is a notoriously inefficient design. On a calm day, the column of smoke might rise straight and true. But on a windy day, the smoke is blown back down, filling the entire hall with a thick, acrid, and suffocating haze. The air inside the longhouse is often a blurry gray fog. It stings the eyes, making them red and watery. It catches in the throat, leading to a constant hacking cough. Over the months of winter, every surface inside the longhouse, the wooden walls, the hanging looms, the sleeping benches, and the very lungs of the inhabitants becomes coated in a thin, greasy layer of black soot. Respiratory illness was a constant and often fatal part of a Viking winter. Another of the brutal realities of this confinement is that the family does not live alone. In the partitioned-off section, at the far end of the longhouse, separated only by a low wooden wall, live their most valuable animals. It's the milk cow, a few sheep, and the goats all share the same roof, their body heat a vital contribution to the warmth of the building. But this also means that the longhouse is, in part, a barn. The rich, pungent smell of livestock is an ever-present and inescapable part of the atmosphere. The sounds of the animals, the lowing of the cow, the bleating of the goats, the rustle of their bedding are a constant background noise. The floor of this section, a mixture of dirt and animal dung, creates a constant battle against filth and smell, a grim daily task for Eric and his son. In these conditions, with a dozen or more family members and their livestock, all living in a single, unventilated, smoke-filled room, the lack of privacy is absolute. Every argument, every sickness, every moment of despair is a public event. The psychological pressure of this forced, unceasing proximity is immense. A modern person, accustomed to personal space and quiet, would find this aspect of the winter ordeal to be a unique and maddening form of torture. The battle against the cold was not just a passive act of huddling by the fire. It was a battle of constant, endless work. With the outside world frozen and inaccessible, the life of the family turned inward, focusing on the multitude of tasks that had been set aside during the busy harvest months. There was no idleness in a Viking winter. To be idle was to waste precious resources and to allow the mind to wander into the dark, dangerous territory of despair. Eric's days were spent in the small circle of firelight, his hands always busy. His primary responsibility was the maintenance of the family's tools and weapons. A man's axe was his most important possession, and the winter was the time to ensure it was in perfect condition for the spring. He would sit for hours on a low wooden stool, a whetstone in his hand, meticulously sharpening the blade of his axe. The rhythmic scraping sound of steel on stone was a familiar and strangely comforting noise in the quiet longhouse. He would work the edge until it was sharp enough to shave with, his movements patient and practiced. He would then inspect the wooden haft for any cracks, and carefully apply a fresh layer of pine tar to the iron axe head to protect it from the corrosive dampness of the smoky air. He performed the same ritual with the family's knives, wood-carving tools, and fishing spears. Sigurd's world was the great vertical loom that stood against one of the long walls of the house. Weaving was the primary work of the women during the winter, a task that was both creative and essential. The loom was a magnificent and complex machine of wood and stone, its warp threads held taut by a series of heavy fist-sized stones. The rhythmic thump-clack of her weaving sword. A heavy, flattened piece of wood used to beat the weft threads tightly into place was the steady heartbeat of the longhouse. She would work for hours in the dim light, her hands moving with a practiced grace. Her eyes focused on the intricate patterns of the wool as they slowly emerged. The cloth she was weaving would become the family's tunics, their cloaks, their blankets, the very fabric of their survival against the cold. When not at the loom, her hands were still busy. She would take out a bundle of raw, greasy wool and begin the long process of carding it, combing the fibers with two-pronged iron combs to align them for spinning. Then she would take out her drop spindle, a simple wooden stick with a stone or clay whorl at the bottom. She would spin the carded wool into thread, the spindle twirling in a steady hypnotic dance as she drew out the fibers. It was a slow, meditative process, a skill that had been passed down through countless generations of women. The air around her would be filled with the faint, oily smell of lanolin from the raw wool. The children were not allowed to be idle either. The winter was their school. Eric would teach his son, Olaf, the basics of woodworking. He would give him a small, blunt knife and a piece of soft pine, and show him how to carve a simple wooden toy or the handle for a tool.
Wow.
He taught him how to read the grain of the wood, how to use the knife safely, the importance of patience and precision. Sigrid, in turn, would teach her daughter Freya the essential skills of the household. She would show her how to use the drop spindle, her small hands clumsy at first, but slowly learning the rhythm. She taught her the basics of mending, how to use a delicate bone needle and a thread of her own making to stitch a tear in a worn-out tunic. These were not just chores. They were the essential lessons of survival, the knowledge that would one day allow them to run their own households. This endless, repetitive work was the true fabric of the Viking winter. It was a defense against the cold, providing them with warm clothes and sharp tools. But more importantly, it was a defense against the darkness, kept their hands and minds occupied, giving them a sense of purpose and a tangible result for their efforts. It was a quiet, determined, and unending battle against the slow, creeping madness of the long, dark, and silent night. As the deep winter months of January and February set in, the battle against the cold became a battle against hunger. The family's carefully stored provisions, which had seemed so abundant in the autumn, now began to look frighteningly small. The constant gnawing cold required the body to burn more energy, and the family's appetite grew even as their food supply shrank. Once a week, Eric and Sigrid would conduct a grim and silent inventory of their storehouse. By the flickering light of a tallow lamp, they would count the remaining pieces of salted fish, measure the level of the grain in the barrels, and inspect the salted meat for any sign of rot. Each week the supply was noticeably smaller, and a cold, quiet fear began to settle in their hearts. The quality of the food also began to deteriorate. The salted pork, after months of storage, was now incredibly tough and so salty that it had to be soaked in precious water for hours before it was palatable. The dried cod was as hard as a wooden plank and had to be pounded with a mallet before it could be cooked. The last of the stored apples were shriveled and soft. Every meal was a monotonous reminder of their dwindling resources. The rationing became more severe. The portions of porridge, which were already small, were reduced further. The children, always hungry, would look at their bowls with a silent, pleading hunger that was a constant pain in Sigurd's heart. Hunger was no longer a temporary discomfort. It was a permanent state of being, a dull, hollow ache in the pit of the stomach that was a constant companion to the cold. This physical deprivation began to wear on the family's spirits. The easy, quiet rhythm of their winter work was now tinged with a new anxiety. Eric would work on his tools, his movements still precise, but his face was grimmer, his thoughts on the dwindling food supply. Sigrid would sit at her loom, the thumb clack of the weaving sword a steady beat against the backdrop of their growing fear. It was in these darkest, hungriest moments that the power of storytelling became more important than ever. It was a way to feed the spirit when the body was starving. The epic sagas of gods and heroes were for the early winter, for building courage. Now, a different kind of story was needed. One evening, as the family huddled by the fire, their stomachs aching with hunger, Sigrid began to speak. Her voice was not the booming, epic chant of Eric, but a quiet, soft, and mesmerizing whisper. She told the children the stories of the Landvader, the ancient spirits of the land. In every rock, in every stream, in every ancient tree, she murmured, there lives a spirit. They are the guardians of this place. They were here long before we came, and they will be here long after we are gone. They are the hidden people. You must always be respectful of them. She told them tales of the trolls that lived deep in the dark, snow-covered mountains, who would come down to the valleys in the deepest part of winter, their great stony forms indistinguishable from the landscape. She spoke of the dwarves, the master craftsmen who lived beneath the earth, forging magical treasures in their secret smithies. These were not stories of great battles, but of a hidden, magical world that existed just alongside their own. They were tales that taught the children the importance of respect for nature, of the unseen forces that governed their world. They were a way to populate the vast, empty, and terrifying landscape outside their door with a sense of mystery and wonder, rather than just cold, empty dread. And in this world of hardship, the smallest of joys became significant, treasured events. One day, Sigrid would bring out a small clay pot of honey, which she had been saving. She would give each of the children a single tiny spoonful of the sweet golden liquid. The taste was an explosion of pure, unadulterated joy in their world of blandness, a memory of the summer sun and the flowers of the meadow. Another evening, Eric might take out a small, simple flute carved from a piece of bone. He would play a quiet, mournful tune, its simple melody filling the smoky hall, a sound of pure, human emotion in the great, silent wilderness. These small, precious moments of sweetness and beauty were the threads of hope that they clung to, the proof that even in the deepest, darkest part of the winter, the human spirit could still find a way to create its own small, defiant light. As the winter ground on, a new and more intimate enemy made its home in the longhouse: sickness. The conditions were a perfect breeding ground for illness. The constant, acrid smoke irritated the lungs. The lack of sunlight weakened the body's defenses. The damp, cold air seemed to seep into the very bones. And the close, constant proximity of both humans and animals meant that any cough, any fever, would spread with a terrifying speed. The first to fall ill was the youngest, Freya. It began with a simple cough, a small, dry sound in the smoky darkness of the longhouse. But within a few days, it had deepened into a harsh, rattling sound that shook her small body, A fever took hold, leaving her skin hot and dry to the touch, her eyes glassy and unfocused. For Eric and Sigrid, this was a new and more profound kind of terror. The dangers of the outside world, the cold, the snow, the wild animals, were things they could fight against. But this was an enemy from within, an invisible poison that was consuming their child. There was no doctor to call upon. Their only defense was Sigrid's knowledge of traditional folk medicine, a wisdom that had been passed down through generations of women. She became a tireless, vigilant nurse. She would brew teas from the dried herbs she had gathered in the autumn, hoping to soothe the girl's cough. She made a pungent poultice of moss and lichen, which she placed on the child's chest, a desperate attempt to draw out the sickness. But their medicine was a mixture of the practical and the magical. Alongside the herbal remedies, Sigrid would perform the ancient rituals. She would sit by her daughter's bedside for hours, her voice a low, hypnotic hum as she chanted the old healing charms. Prayers to the goddess Ire to spare her child. She carved a powerful rune, the Uru's rune for strength, onto a small, flat stone and placed it under the child's pillow. Eric could do nothing but watch, a feeling of utter helplessness gnawing at him. He was a strong man, a man who could build a house and fight a wolf, but against this sickness, his strength was useless. He would spend his days working with a silent, grim fury, chopping wood or mending tools, trying to channel his fear and his frustration into the simple, physical act of labor. The illness cast a dark shadow over the entire longhouse. The atmosphere became heavy with a new kind of tension, a quiet, somber dread. The children's laughter was gone. Even the animals seemed to be quieter, more subdued. The long, dark winter night, once a time for stories and a fragile sense of community, was now a time of fearful vigil. Every cough from the small bed, a sound that would cause both parents to start from their sleep. After a week that felt like a lifetime, the fever finally broke. One morning, Freya woke up, her eyes clear, her skin cool to the touch. She was weak, but she had survived. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over the family. But the ordeal had left its mark. They were all thinner, wearier. The sickness had consumed a precious portion of their physical reserves and a great deal of their emotional strength. They had survived the battle against the cold. They had survived the battle against the darkness. And now they had survived the battle against sickness. But the winter was not over. The food stores were lower than ever, and their bodies and spirits were at their most fragile. The great white wolf of the Scandinavian winter was still howling outside their door. And the hardest, most desperate part of their journey through the long night was still to come. The sickness had passed, but had left a shadow behind. The family was weaker, their food stores were smaller, and the winter was far from over. They had survived the battle against the cold and the battle against disease. Now began the third, and perhaps most difficult, war. The battle against the darkness within their own minds. This was the true test of the Viking winter, a psychological ordeal of profound and crushing isolation. As the calendar turned to February, the coldest and darkest month, the world outside the longhouse became a truly alien landscape. The sun was a distant memory, a pale god who had abandoned them. The days were nothing more than a few hours of dim, gray twilight, before the immense 18-hour night descended again, a suffocating blanket of absolute blackness. The longhouse, which had been a fortress, now felt more like a tomb. The constant confinement began to wear on the family's nerves. The same smoky air, the same four walls, the same faces, day after day, week after week. The world shrank until it was composed of nothing but the flickering orange light of the hearth fire and the vast oppressive darkness that pressed in on all sides. This endless darkness had a profound effect on their minds. Their sense of time, already warped, began to dissolve completely. They would sleep for long, strange hours, their dreams vivid and disturbing, and wake unsure if it was day or night. A deep, unshakable lethargy settled over them, a winter sadness that sapped their energy and their will. It was in this dark, quiet, and isolated world that the old fears and superstitions began to take on a new and terrifying life. The stories that Eric and Sigrid had told to pass the time now felt less like entertainment and more like a description of the world just outside their door. The lines between the world of men and the world of myths began to blur. Their greatest fear was of the Draugr. These were not simple ghosts. They were the corporeal, walking dead. Creatures of immense strength and malevolence who were believed to guard their burial mounds and to hate the living. The sagas were filled with tales of these terrifying beings, and in the deep, silent darkness of the winter night, these stories felt chillingly real. Every strange sound from the outside was now a source of potential terror. The creak of the roof timbers under a heavy load of snow could be the footsteps of a monster on their roof. The howl of a wolf in the distant snow-covered forest could be the cry of a restless spirit. The world beyond their door was no longer just empty and cold. It was haunted. One night a particularly loud crack echoed through the longhouse, likely a tree branch, heavy with ice, finally snapping under the strain. But in the tense, fearful silence of the hall, the sound was something more. The children gasped, their eyes wide with terror. Even Eric, a man who feared little, instinctively reached for the handle of the axe that was always by his side. They would sit by the fire for hours, their bodies rigid, listening. Every gust of wind that rattled the wooden door, every rustle of the animals in their pen was a potential threat. They were a tiny, fragile island of life in a world that belonged to the cold, the dark, and the things that walked in the night. This was the true, brutal reality of the Viking winter. It was not just a struggle against hunger and cold, but a struggle against one's own mind. It was a battle to maintain sanity in a world where the sun had disappeared. And the old dark stories of monsters and spirits felt more real than the memories of the summer. This constant, low-level fear began to exert a powerful pressure on the social fabric of the family and the village. The bonds of community, so strong during the productive summer months, were tested to their absolute limits by the crushing intimacy and enforced idleness of the deep winter. The longhouse was not just a physical shelter, it was a pressure cooker for human emotion. The children, denied the freedom to run and play in the fields, became listless and irritable. They would bicker and fight over small wooden toys, their frustrations amplified by the close confines of the hall. Sigrid, her patience worn thin by the constant darkness and the worry over their dwindling food, would have to separate them, her voice sharper than usual. Even the strong bond between Eric and Sigrid began to show the strain. They were a good partnership, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a lifetime of shared labor. But the endless, unchanging days, the lack of privacy, and the constant underlying anxiety began to create small fissures in their relationship. A misplaced tool, a comment taken the wrong way, could lead to a rare and unsettling argument, their harsh whispers a jarring sound in the otherwise quiet hall. This tension was mirrored in the village as a whole. With no raids to plan, no ships to build, and no fields to work, the young, aggressive warriors of the village grew restless. Their energy with no outlet would curdle into a dangerous, frustrated boredom. Old feuds and simmering resentments between families, which had been forgotten during the busy summer, would resurface in the smoky darkness of the longhouses. One day a dispute broke out between two families over the ownership of a small patch of woodland, and therefore its precious supply of firewood. The argument, which had started as a quiet disagreement, quickly escalated into angry shouts and threats. The village elders had to intervene, their faces grim, to settle the matter with a stern judgment before it could spill over into true violence. In this dark and introspective world, dreams took on a profound significance. The Vikings believed that dreams were not just random firings of the mind, but were often portents, messages from the gods, or glimpses into the future. But in the deep winter, the dreams of the villagers were often dark and troubled, reflecting their anxieties. Sigrid woke one morning, her face pale, her body trembling. She had dreamed of a great black wolf, its eyes burning like embers, that had come down from the mountains and was circling their longhouse, its howls a sound of pure desolation. She did not dismiss it as a simple nightmare. For her it was a powerful and terrifying omen, a sign that a great misfortune was coming. The family spent the rest of the day in a state of somber quiet. The weight of the dream, a heavy presence in the room. The long, idle hours also became a time for memory, but not always of the pleasant kind. Eric, sitting by the fire carving a piece of wood, would find his mind drifting back to the raids of his youth. He would not remember the glory or the treasure, but the other things. He would remember the terrified face of a monk in a foreign land. He would remember the weight of a dying friend in his arms. These were the ghosts of his past, memories that were normally kept at bay by the hard, distracting work of the farm. But in the quiet, contemplative darkness of the winter, they would return unbidden. This was a common affliction for the older warriors, a private, unspoken battle with the memories of the violence that had shaped their lives. This was the true darkness within. It was not the fear of a monster outside the door, but the fear of the monsters within, the despair born of hunger and confinement, the fraying of the bonds of family and community, the haunting of old ghosts, and the slow, creeping certainty that the sun might never truly return. The deep winter was a time when the boundaries between worlds felt thin. The darkness was not just an absence of light. It was a presence in itself, a living entity that pressed against the thick oak walls of the longhouse. In this environment, every fear, every superstition was magnified. And soon the family's vague mythological fears would take on a terrifyingly real and tangible form. It began with the livestock. The animals, who had been a quiet, comforting presence in their end of the hall, became restless and agitated at night. The cow would low nervously, and the sheep would bunch together, their eyes wide and fearful. At first, Eric dismissed it as a consequence of the long confinement. But then he started to notice other signs. One morning, after a fresh, light snowfall, he found tracks in the snow just a few yards from their longhouse door. They were not the tracks of a deer or a fox. They were large, canine prints, the tracks of a wolf. But it was not a single wolf. It was a pack. Driven by the deep snow and the scarcity of prey in the high mountains, The wolves were venturing down into the fjord, their hunger making them bold. The news spread quickly and quietly through the village. The wolf was a creature of both the real world and the world of myth. It was a physical danger to their livestock and a potential threat to their children. But it was also a creature of dark symbolism, the embodiment of chaos and destruction. The kin of the great wolf Fenrir, who was destined to slay Odin at Ragnarok, the end of the world. Sigurd's dream of the black wolf no longer felt like a mere nightmare. It felt like a prophecy. The fear in the longhouse was now a palpable thing. The howling of the wind outside was no longer just the sound of the weather. Every moan, every whistle could be the howl of a hungry wolf. The family would huddle closer to the fire at night, the children's eyes wide with a new and specific terror. The darkness outside was no longer just empty, it was watching. The attack came on the coldest night of the year, a night of absolute, still cold, under a sky filled with a cruel glitter of stars. It began not with a roar, but with a low, guttural snarl from the animal buyer at the end of the hall. The cow let out a terrified bellow, and the sheep began to bleat in a panic. Eric was on his feet in an instant, his great battle axe in his hands. He and his son Olaf rushed to the low wooden partition that separated them from their animals. They could hear the sounds clearly now, the frantic, terrified movements of their livestock, and the low, menacing growls of the wolves just on the other side of the thin outer wall. They could hear the scratching of claws against the thick oak planks, the sound of a heavy body thudding against the wood. As the wolves tested the structure, searching for a weakness for a way in, this was the ultimate terror of the winter night. The monster was not a mythical beast from a story. It was a real, hungry predator, and it was trying to break into their home. Eric stood guard by the partition for the rest of the night, his great axe resting on his shoulder, his body a silent, menacing statue in the flickering firelight. He listened to every sound, his senses on high alert. The wolves, unable to find a way through the thick timbers, eventually gave up, their frustrated howls fading into the distance. But the psychological damage was done. The longhouse, their only sanctuary, their fortress against the winter, now felt fragile and vulnerable. The thin wooden walls, which had seemed so strong, felt like a flimsy barrier against the vast, hostile wilderness that surrounded them. The incident solidified all their fears into a single terrifying certainty. The outside world was not just indifferent. It was actively trying to kill them. It was a world of cold, of darkness, of sickness, and of real, tangible monsters with teeth and claws. Their survival now depended on their own strength, the thickness of their walls, the hope that they could outlast the hunger of the wolves, and the even deeper hunger of the winter itself. The night of the wolf attack was a turning point. The threat was no longer a distant, howling sound in the forest or a frightening figure from a story. It was a real and present danger, a hungry beast scratching at their very door. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the longhouse shifted from one of quiet dread to one of grim, vigilant readiness. Eric spent the next few days reinforcing their home. He used his axe and adze to fashion heavy wooden bars for the doors. He barricaded the small, shuttered openings high on the walls that were used for ventilation. The longhouse, which had once felt like a prison, was now consciously transformed into a fortress. Every evening, as the deep, oppressive darkness fell, he would secure the bars, the heavy thump of the wood, a final, definitive sound that sealed them in for the night. This new, heightened state of fear took its toll. The children were forbidden from going outside, even for a moment. They became pale and withdrawn, their world shrinking to the few square feet of the firelit hall. Sigurd's stories around the fire changed. The tales of gods and heroes were replaced by darker stories, tales of Draugr and the monstrous wolves of the Ironwood, stories that reflected the family's own deep-seated anxieties. As the days grew shorter and the food stores dwindled even further, the family turned more and more to their faith. With the physical world offering nothing but cold and danger, their only refuge was the spiritual one. One evening, Eric decided that a significant offering was needed. It was a time of great desperation, a time to appeal directly to the gods. He performed a small, private, or sacrifice by the hearth fire. It was not a grand public ceremony, but a quiet, solemn, and intensely personal ritual. He took one of their last precious chickens. With a swift and practiced movement, he offered the animal's life to the gods, its blood a dark stain on the snow outside the door. He then cooked the meat, a rare and treasured feast in their world of hunger. As the family ate the small portions in a reverent silence, Eric chanted a prayer to the All-Father, Odin, for wisdom and perseverance, and to Thor for the strength to protect his family from the beasts that lurked in the darkness. It was a desperate plea for protection, a renewal of their pact with the powerful and often unpredictable gods who governed their world. The weight of responsibility on Eric was immense. He was the patriarch, the protector, the sole provider in this frozen, hostile world. He had to be the rock upon which his family's survival was built. He showed them a face of grim, unshakable resolve. But in the quiet, darkest hours of the night, when he thought the others were asleep, he would sit by the dying embers of the fire, his great axe across his lap, and his face would betray the deep, gnawing fear that he kept hidden during the day. He feared not for his own life, but for the lives of his children. He feared the wolves, he feared the sickness, and most of all, he feared the slow, quiet, creeping threat of starvation. He was trapped in a battle against an enemy he could not fight with his axe. The winter itself, all he could do was endure and wait, and hope that his strength and his food would not run out before the sun returned. And so, the family existed, suspended in the deep heart of the Scandinavian winter. They were a tiny, fragile spark of life in a world of ice and darkness. They were surrounded by enemies, both real and imagined. Their bodies were weak with hunger, and their minds were frayed by the long, oppressive night. They had survived the darkness of the sky, but they were now lost in the darkness within. The coldest, most desperate part of their ordeal was still to come. March arrived, but it brought no immediate relief. In the high north, March is not a month of spring, but a month of deep and bitter winter. It is often the cruelest month, a time when the accumulated hardships of the past season reach their breaking point. For Eric, Sigrid, and their children, it was the time of the great hunger. The food stores were now almost entirely gone. The last of the salted fish had been eaten, its bones boiled into a thin, tasteless broth. The final sacks of grain were empty, save for a few handfuls of dusty flour at the bottom. Their diet was now a grim, desperate affair, consisting of small portions of bark from the slippery elm tree, which Sigrid would boil for hours to make it digestible, and the last of the tough, stringy root vegetables they had stored. The effects of this near starvation were profound. The family moved through their days in a state of slow, lethargic weakness. The children, once full of energy, were now quiet and listless, their faces thin and pale. Eric, who had been a man of great physical strength, now found that simply walking the length of the longhouse left him breathless. Hunger was a constant, physical pain, a hollow, aching emptiness that was never, ever satisfied. The cold was also at its most intense. Their great pile of firewood, which had seemed so immense in the autumn, was now a small, precious mound. The fire in the central hearth was no longer a roaring, comforting blaze, but was kept to a small, smoldering pile of embers, a tiny spark of life that offered little warmth. They would spend their days huddled together under a pile of furs, their bodies shivering, their only activity to tell quiet, whispered stories. It was in this state of profound weakness and despair that nature played its cruelest trick. For 3 days, the weather changed. A warm wind, a chinook, blew in from the south. The temperature rose, and the great thick blanket of snow that had covered the world for months began to melt. The sound of dripping water from the eaves of the longhouse, a sound they had longed to hear, filled the air. A desperate, frantic hope surged through the village. Was it over? Was this the spring? The men, with what little strength they had left, began to dig out their fishing gear from the snowdrifts, their minds filled with the thought of fresh fish from the fjord. But the elders, the ones who knew the ways of the north, watched the sky with a grim, knowing silence. Their pessimism was justified. On the 4th day, the warm wind died and the temperature plummeted. A blizzard of unimaginable fury descended upon the fjord, a final, violent assault from the dying winter. The fresh, melting snow turned to a thick sheet of ice, and a new, deep layer of snow buried the village once more. The brief false spring was over, and the return of the deep winter felt like a final, mocking blow. The despair that followed this false thaw was the deepest the family had yet known. It was the death of hope, a feeling more chilling than any winter wind. They retreated back into the smoky darkness of the longhouse, their spirits utterly broken. They were at the very end of their endurance. And then, a week later, a true change began. It was not a dramatic event. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. Sigrid was the first to notice it. As she sat by the fire in the late afternoon, she realized that the sliver of gray light coming through the smoke hole in the roof was lingering just a few minutes longer than it had the week before. A long, oppressive night was finally, truly, beginning to retreat. Then, a few days after that, Eric heard a new sound. It was not the howl of the wind or the groan of the timbers. It was a slow, steady, and beautifully monotonous sound. Drip, drip. He looked up. A single fat icicle that had been hanging from the edge of their roof for months had begun to melt. It was the first true sign of the thaw. It was a small thing, but in their world of darkness and despair, it was a miracle. It was a promise. A quiet, weary, and fragile hope began to return to the longhouse. It was not the frantic, desperate hope of the false spring, but a deeper, more resilient one. The winter was not eternal. The sun was coming back. The world was beginning to wake up. The first signs of the thaw were a slow and delicate magic. The steady, monotonous drip of the melting icicles became the new rhythm of the longhouse, a gentle and hopeful sound that replaced the oppressive silence of the deep winter. The great mounds of snow that had piled up against the walls began to shrink, slowly revealing the dark, damp wood beneath. The world, which had been a stark and unchanging canvas of white, was beginning to show the first hints of its true colors again. This period of melting was not without its own dangers. The warming sun that melted the snow on the roof also melted the great drifts on the steep mountainsides that surrounded the fjord. The family would often hear a low, distant rumble, a sound that would grow into a deafening roar as a great avalanche of snow, ice, and rock would thunder down the mountainside. A reminder that the world in its waking was still a violent and unpredictable place. But with the thaw came the return of life. The first to announce the coming of spring were the birds. One morning, Sigrid heard a new sound on the wind, a cheerful, trilling song that she had not heard in many months. It was a snow bunting, a small, hardy bird, a sure sign that the great migration from the south had begun. In the days that followed, more birds would arrive, their calls a joyous chorus that broke the long silence of the winter. With the snows receding, Eric, his body still weak, but his spirit filled with a new hunter's resolve, took up his spear and his bow. The family's survival depended on finding fresh meat. He ventured into the dark, damp pine forest that bordered their land. The going was difficult. The snow was still deep in the shadows of the trees, a wet, heavy, and exhausting blanket to wade through. He walked for hours, his senses on high alert. Searching for any sign of life, he finally found what he was looking for: the fresh tracks of a deer, a creature that had been driven down from the high mountains by the deep snow. He began to track the animal, his movements slow, silent, and patient, all the skills of a lifetime of hunting returning to him. The hunt was a long and arduous affair, a test of his depleted stamina. But finally he was successful. The sight of the deer, a source of 100 pounds of fresh meat, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The work of carrying the animal back to the village was immense, but he did it with a joyful strength, his heart filled with a profound sense of relief. He was a provider again. That night, for the first time in many months, the family feasted. The smell of roasting venison filled the smoky longhouse, a rich, savory aroma that was a world away from the grim smell of boiled bark and salted fish. They ate until their stomachs were full, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost painful. It was a feast of survival, a celebration of the end of the great hunger. The final and most dramatic sign of the winter's end was the breaking of the ice on the fjord. It began with a low, groaning sound, a deep, resonant complaint that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. Then came a great cracking sound, like a thunderclap, that echoed through the valley. The great solid sheet of ice that had sealed the ford for months was beginning to break apart. For the next few days, the fjord was a scene of chaotic, grinding power. Great city block-sized plates of ice would collide, their edges pushing up against each other to create small, temporary mountains. The sound was a constant grinding and groaning symphony. Finally, the tide and the current of the river that fed the fjord won their battle. The great ice plates were swept out to sea, and the dark, cold, life-giving water of the fjord was free once more. The prison doors were open. Their isolation was over. They could fish again. They could launch their longship again. The world, which had shrunk to the size of their small, smoky room, had now expanded back to the horizon. The battle against the cold was over. They had endured, and they had survived. With the fjord finally free of its icy chains, a new kind of work began, the work of rejoining the world. The first priority for every family in the village was to find fresh food from the sea. Eric and his son Olaf spent a full day meticulously checking their small fishing boat, which had been stored under the eaves of the longhouse all winter. They retarred the seams, mended the nets, and made it seaworthy once more. The next morning, they pushed the boat out onto the calm, frigid waters of the fjord. The air was still bitingly cold, but it was a clean, fresh cold, a world away from the stale, smoky air of the longhouse. For Olaf, who had been confined for months, the simple feeling of being on the open water again was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. They spent the day fishing, their hands numb from the icy water as they hauled in their nets. The catch was good. The fjord, having rested all winter, was teeming with life. They returned to the village in the evening with a boat full of cod and herring. The sight of the fresh silver-skinned fish was a beautiful one, a tangible promise that the time of hunger was finally over. While the men returned to the sea, the women began the great spring cleaning of the longhouses. Sigrid, with Freya as her helper, threw open the heavy wooden doors, letting the fresh, cold air and the pale spring sunlight into the dark, smoky hall for the first time in months. The light revealed a world of winter grime. Every surface was coated in a thick, greasy layer of soot from the fire, and the earthen floor was damp and foul. The work of cleaning the longhouse was a monumental task. All the sleeping benches were taken outside to be aired out. The old dirty straw from the floor and the animal byre was shoveled out, a heavy and foul-smelling job, and replaced with fresh, dry straw. The wooden walls were scrubbed down with a mixture of sand and water to remove the worst of the soot. Sigrid and the other women of the village took the winter-'s worth of dirty woolen and linen garments down to the stream. They spent days washing the clothes in the frigid, fast-moving water, beating them against the rocks to remove the ingrained dirt and grime. It was cold, back-breaking work, but it was a ritual of purification. The village of Alrekstad slowly began to come back to life. The oppressive silence of the winter was replaced by the sounds of industry. The rhythmic thump-thump of the blacksmith's hammer could be heard from the forge as he repaired the tools that had broken during the winter. The sound of axes echoed from the forest as men began to chop fresh firewood. The children, finally released from their long confinement, ran and shouted in the muddy fields, their laughter a sound that had been absent for too long. But the arrival of spring was also a time of sober accounting. Not everyone in the village had survived a long night. An old man had succumbed to a lung sickness from the smoke. A child from another family had been taken by a fever. There were no grand memorials, but there was a quiet, shared understanding of the loss. The community was a little smaller, a little more scarred, but it had endured. In the evenings, the families would once again gather around the hearth fire. But now, the stories they told were different. They were not the old sagas of gods and monsters. They told the story of their own winter, of their own survival. They spoke of the great blizzards, of the fear of the wolves, of the gnawing hunger. They were turning their own hardship into a story, a new saga to be passed on to their children, a testament to their own resilience. As the last of the snow melted from the high mountain peaks, and the days grew long and filled with a gentle, enduring light, the final definitive sign of the winter's end arrived. One bright afternoon, a lookout spotted a sail on the distant open sea at the mouth of the fjord. It was the first trading ship of the season, a welcome and eagerly awaited sight. The arrival of the ship was a cause for great celebration. The entire village, men, women, and children, gathered on the shore to welcome the traders. It was their first contact with the outside world in over 6 months. The traders brought with them not just good salt, iron, and fine cloth, but also news. They brought tales of the political struggles in other lands, of the fortunes of other jarls, of the state of the world beyond their small, isolated fjord. For Eric and his family, it was a moment of profound significance. They were rejoining the great, interconnected web of Norse life. They traded their own winter's work, Sigrid's finely woven cloth, and Eric's surplus of carved wooden tools for the precious salt that would allow them to preserve the next season's catch. The cycle of life, of work and reward was beginning again. The winter had left its mark on them all. They were thinner, their faces more gaunt, their bodies bearing the memory of the long, gnawing hunger. The children were a little less innocent, their eyes now holding a quiet, sober understanding of the true harshness of the world. But they were also stronger, more resilient. They were a family that had faced the abyss together and had survived. The shared hardship had forged a new, deeper, and unspoken bond between them. To celebrate their survival and to give thanks to the gods for the return of the sun and the CS bounty, the village held a great spring feast, a Varblot. It was a joyous, communal affair, a stark and wonderful contrast to the grim, private Yule feast they had held in the depths of the winter. A great bonfire was lit on the beach, its flames leaping high into the bright evening sky. The villagers brought forth the best of their new, fresh food: roasted fish, boiled eggs from the returning seabirds, and the first tender green shoots of wild garlic gathered from the forest. They drank strong, fresh ale, and the sounds of laughter and music filled the fjord, a joyous noise that chased away the lingering ghosts of the long night. Brand, the old skald, told a new story. It was not a tale of gods and monsters from the ancient past. It was the story of their own winter, a saga of their own survival. He spoke of the great blizzards, of the fear of the wolves, of the gnawing hunger. He transformed their suffering into a heroic tale, a testament to the strength and resilience of their community. Later that night, Eric stood alone on the shore. He watched the moonlight glitter on the calm, dark water of the fjord. The air was cool, but it was a gentle, living coolness, not the dead, predatory cold of the winter. He looked at the longhouse, a warm golden light glowing from its open door, the sound of his children's laughter drifting out to him. He thought of the long, dark months they had just endured. He had faced the despair of the darkness, the fear of the wolves, and the gnawing terror of starvation. He had been pushed to the very edge of his own endurance. He had survived, and in that survival, he had come to understand the true nature of his world. He understood that the life of a Viking was not just about the glorious raids and the epic sagas. It was about this quiet, fierce, and unyielding determination to endure. It was about the strength of one's family, the resilience of one's community, and the simple, profound, and life-giving joy of the returning sun. And so, the long, dark night of the Viking winter finally comes to an end. Theirs is a story of quiet, grim endurance, a testament to the incredible resilience of a people who lived on the very edge of the world. It is a story written not in the grand sagas of kings, but in the smoky air of a longhouse, in the taste of a meager meal, and in the simple, profound joy of the returning sun. Their long watch is over. The fire has been kept. And now your journey for tonight can come to a peaceful close as well. There are no more blizzards to endure, no more wolves at the door. There is only the quiet of this moment. Let the story fade and allow your mind to drift into a deep and well-deserved rest. Sleep well.